About 5 after 12, we should get started. This is the meeting of the Assembly's Ad Hoc Labor Subcommittee, which is addressing a number of issues related to the referendum regarding AO 37. Can we start with a roll call? Have the committee members please identify themselves.
Pete Peterson.
Dick Training.
Elby Gray Jackson, not on the committee, but I'm here.
Tim Steele on the committee in here.
Bill Evans.
Jennifer Johnston.
Okay, we do have the full committee is here. Would our guests like to identify themselves just so we know who all is in attendance? If you're representing any particular group, let us know.
Dennis Wheeler, municipal attorney.
Lucinda Mahoney, CFO.
Barbara Huff, Techness, Teamsters, Local 959.
Daniel Rapaski, IBEW Local 1547 and Anchorage Central Labor Council.
Jason Howard, Local 302, Operating Engineers.
Teresa Hillhouse, Labor Relations Director.
Bruno Modelevich, AEA.
Andy Holloman, AEA.
Nancy Yu, Sarah, ER Director.
Brian Murphy, Local 1264, firefighters.
My name is Josh Trabig. I'm an intern here.
Okay, have you all got a copy of the agenda? If so, are there any additions or changes to the agenda? I would actually like to make one addition. Under new business, I would like to add a new item C, which will be an update from the clerk's office on the status of the discussions with the state clerk regarding the election. Any other additions or issues with the agenda? Seeing none, the agenda.
Actually, we might want to reverse the order because we're still waiting on copies of the ordinance about it.
On whose thing?
On my ordinance.
Okay. So if that's agreeable to everybody, we'll just, why don't we start then with the update from the municipal clerk's office, and if the copies aren't available, we can go to item C first, because those aren't going to take any documents, and then we'll get into the two proposed amendments, if that's okay with the body. Any objections? Okay, so why don't we begin with what is the new item C on the agenda, and it's an update from the municipal clerk. Ms. Jones, can you brief us on the status of the discussions with the state regarding the election in November?
Certainly. I spoke with Gail Fanumii today, and as you know, she had a big deadline yesterday regarding the state's election, so she has been busy. And we did talk about how we're going to proceed with an agreement between the municipality and the state for the municipality either to put an issue on the November state ballot or for the municipality to have a concurrent election. And what we have decided to do is I'm going to pose some questions to her by the end of the day today, some of the issues that the question that we'd like if they could put it on their ballot, and some other issues. And she has a meeting with her division managers next Tuesday, and she'll get back to us with a response by the end of next week.
Are there any questions for Ms. Jones? Ellie?
I think Dick was first. You can let him go first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Barbara, what's the cost going to be if we do election with the state versus concurrent election?
We don't know the answer to that. That will be one of the things that I expect that the state division elections will report back to us. I expect that there will be some cost for the question to be on their ballot. I think that the cost for a question to be on their ballot will be less than if we have a concurrent election. I don't know what that will be, but I think it would be less.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, the deadline was July 1st for you and
Gail to come to some agreement, but it sounds as if there is going to be an agreement. Is that correct? One way or another.
When I spoke to Gail today, I did ask her if we could come to some agreement, and that I would like some type of an agreement in writing before July 1st.
Okay.
The clerk's office had an MOU with the state in 1999. We've got that document. We've done this before. It shouldn't be, it isn't a major new undertaking.
Right. If I could follow, Mr. Chairman, please. So, but, okay, my point is that the ordinance says that if you don't come to agreement by July 1st, the election will be moved to April of next year. So it sounds like there's going to be an agreement, so that may very well, April of next year, be on the table.
Well, I'm not going to opine about that, but I am going to try to, my understanding was that the ordinance asked the clerk to enter into an agreement. Am I correct, Mr. Wheeler? Enter
Yes.
into an agreement with the state before July 1st?
I think the date is actually the 7th, but we can.
Okay. And so my goal is to do what the Assembly asked the clerk's office to do in that ordinance, which would be to come up with an agreement on or before July 7th or July 1st.
Right. Not to, make a big deal about this, but just for clarification for all of us. If I can follow Mr. Wheeler, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Okay, but it also says that if there's no agreement, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the election will be in April, correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's the only clarification that I wanted to make, but it sounds like things may work out. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions for Ms. Jones? Thank you, Barbara. Okay, we don't have, or do we have a copy?
We have copies.
Okay. There are copies available of Ms. Johnston's proposed amendment, if anybody would like to see those as we go along.
This is different.
It should be the same one, but for those that didn't have copies with them.
I'm going to print this more.
I'll kind of explain it.
We're waiting on a few more copies too.
What we're planning on doing today, for those of you who were at the last subcommittee meeting, we had a couple of ideas that were proposed as resolutions for handling this referendum issue. One of them was by Ms. Johnson, which was essentially a rewrite of the existing labor law. And we also had another proposal by Mr. Trainey of simply a repeal of AO 37. I've asked both of them just to be able to, at this meeting, speak more broadly to their proposed amendments or proposed resolutions. Also, we've asked for comments at the last meeting, and we'll give you an opportunity today if any of the public present wants to comment on any of these issues. I know Ms. Johnson is going to go through her resolution, and as there are several different topics within the resolution, we can take questions on each of the topic. We do not necessarily have to wait until the end, and that goes for the public as well as the committee. If you have any comments or questions on this as we go along, let me know and we can address it kind of in order as they come up. Okay? Sounds good. So with that, Ms. Johnson?
Okay, so basically what I was going to do today, and as the chair said, if you have interest on the item this proposed ordinance is a change in code. It's not, so don't refer to AL 37. You need to refer to code as far as what's happening in this ordinance. And what I'm basically going to do is where the changes of code are in this ordinance, starting in page 3. And you'll note if there's any disagreement or interest or questions on those changes. And some of these changes are cleaning up language, and so we'll go quickly over those unless you have concerns. But the first one on page 3 is the third paragraph. It's a classification plan. And as you see, it says job classification specifications and FLSA designations. And unless I hear any problems, we'll go on to the next. The next one is confidential employees, what that means. And just to sort of point out some of the sort of cleanup language, taking his out. And in the confidential employees, or whose duties require direct or systems access to confidential information which contributes to significantly to the deliberative process and development of municipal law, employee relations, benefits, payroll, and budgetary policy. And if there's no concerns or questions on it, we'll go.
Yes, sir.
Daniel Rapaski. Just curious, historically in labor relations, a confidential employee is pretty well laid out through labor law in this country. Wondering what the impetus for this particular change is. Why did you feel this is necessary?
One of the aspects, I think, of negotiations with unions is payroll and benefits. And so if you have an employee that's working in those systems for an administration and they're also part of a union, so they're part of the, they're kind of on both sides of the table. So I think this is a way of cleaning up that so that there isn't any shared information as far as, it's just so you have the union representation and you have the administration representation. And it's not a matter of having any shared, what could be beneficiary information.
And I think to further expound on that, the current code has a definition in it of confidential employee. This expands it, kind of broadens that definition. So we already had in law what was a confidential employee. This is trying to create a little broader category to take into account some items that we thought should be included in that.
And it's really just, it's the information, having access to information that could be beneficial in the negotiations with the union. Administrative access, in my mind.
Through the chair, Barbara Huff, Tuckness. Question on the confidential employee. How many anticipated municipal employees would you see impacted by this?
I'll have to ask the administration, but I would presume that it's probably not that many at this point because of Kronos. But if somebody in administration could address this.
We would need to research it and get back to you.
Yeah, I can't say offhand how many there would be. It's most of the people that are confidential employees today it won't change. There might be a few positions that could change, particularly executive assistants or something along that line.
Through the chair, I recall that during the work sessions on AO 37, which had this language, there were discussions about the number of employees that may be affected. And I don't recall that number, but we can certainly refer back to those work sessions and then try to extrapolate whether there's been any organizational changes since then that would change the number.
And yes, because I would think at this point, both with our ERP and with Kronos, some of this, my point, policy-wise, is to come up with a labor code that addresses our new workforce and our new technology also. And so, I think as we look at this, we need to think in those terms too.
Any other questions?
Okay, last on page 3 is the emergency declaration. Unless you have any problems with that. And top of page 4, as far as assembly appointing the municipal audit committee or board of equalization, I don't see that as any large problem, nor is the second paragraph. Probably the most substantial would maybe be as far as holiday, and this is just doing something that we've tried to set out a policy where we have standardized holidays, unless there's any concerns.
Mr. Steele?
Yeah, right now different groups have different holidays designated?
And
How significant is it?
There are, I think almost all of the holidays are standard now, with the exception of the police department that currently has an extra half day. They have Christmas Eve, they have the afternoon of Christmas Eve off.
And that's just by tradition, I suspect? Or
Well, and it's
in
by contract, right.
How about Seward's Day in terms of, is that one of those?
Well, we gave the union Seward's Day.
you're saying about our new CABs that we have.
Right, right. But that assumes that IBEW ratifies theirs, but other than that, it's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. Is there still a difference between some employees that have MLK Day and Seward Day? Because I know that some had Seward's Day and some had MLK Day. Does that still exist?
No, they both get each.
So they both get Seward's
Right.
Day?
Right.
All the unions?
Yeah.
Seward's and MLK Day?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But this does not, this particular wording just defines what a holiday is. It does not say that all of them have to be the same or anything in that context.
What they have to, it's going to, yes. you know,
Somewhere else it says it. It doesn't say,
Right.
here
Well,
it
it's
just says this is
recognized
a
by the
definition.
municipality is defined, so the defined holiday is recognized by the municipality. So you're
But that could be different for every unit. Could it not?
I think she wants uniformity.
I want uniformity,
Okay,
yeah.
but you don't say it here, you say it somewhere else.
And capped in the personnel code. The personnel code is what lays out the holidays, which is chapter 3.30.
If it isn't laid out that way, then it isn't a holiday by definition.
Right. Line 40 through 42, my understanding when I was working with municipal attorney, this is peanut language, unless anybody has any problem with it. Second paragraph on page 5. The definition of supervisory employee, and the two additions to supervise other employees and improve time and attendance. Yes, Brian?
Brian Murphy with Local 1264. I guess supervise other employees is a pretty broad statement. I mean, you could say a firefighter supervises a probationary firefighter. Would they be written out of collective bargaining?
I think this is more definitions of supervisory employees, so I think your CABs would address, but Dennis, maybe you could.
That's correct, and I think also the classification process would help in this regard. And to the extent there's a disagreement, this is one of those areas where the board would hear from both the affected union and the municipality as to what the proper classification is.
And that's a board appointed by the mayor?
Hmm?
The ERB board?
Appointed by the mayor, confirmed by the assembly, I believe.
The language on 31, 32 is something that we added back in our original discussions at AO 37, it's just while maintaining financially sound principles. Unless you have any problems with that, we'll go on to page 6, and this is management rights. And A3 adds the word supervise, again, direct and supervise employees. And then number 7, is determine the method, means, equipment, and personnel by which government operations to be conducted, including staffing and scheduling. And line 10 is scheduling employees in its organization and technology or equipment performing its work. And 11, determining key and essential personnel, necessary equipment, and supplies in the event of emergency declaration.
Mr. Training.
Jennifer, do you understand this to then regulate how many firefighters you would have on a vehicle?
I think
The question's been from
right,
4 to 3.
right.
Would this allow management to determine?
Yes, it would, but on the other hand, you would have if we get to a point later on in this ordinance, the negotiations with the unions can negotiate that also. It just would have to be approved by the assembly, one way or the other.
So how is that different than it currently is?
It clarifies it, what it is, that currently it doesn't say that the management has the right of equipment and scheduling. And so if in your CAB, you were going to add or have additional rights for scheduling or additional, 3 versus 4, and that would be part of your CAB, then it would have to come to the assembly and approved, and it'd have to be specified that this is outside of the code. So it's still allowed, it has to be transparent what you're asking and what it does.
I guess then I question the goal of equipment, staffing, scheduling, and safety stuff that we've historically negotiated with.
You still can do that. It's just, we're saying in management, right, they have the right to manage for that. But if you feel it's so important that you need to establish in your CAB that you need to have control over the scheduling, and you need to have control over 4 versus 3, then it goes through the public hearing process, goes to the assembly, and it's passed or not passed. So it's not something that currently what happens, it's in your CAB, and it's just part of your CAB, and it's not addressed in a public fashion. It's not saying that, no, this is beyond the code. And you'll see later on in this ordinance where that language is, in that process.
So I guess I still worry that by having that as management rights, you could potentially go to the assembly, have it fail, and you could potentially start having 1 to 2 people on a fire apparatus showing up to the calls.
And then the assembly would have the public responsibility whether that's a safe or not safe situation. Which is, there is a public responsibility that the mayor and his administration has and the assembly has. And they actually probably are far more responsible for that public than you are as a fireman, but it's their responsibility.
Yeah, but they also don't see on the street how that all works out.
Well, then that's your responsibility to make sure they understand it.
Go ahead, Mr. Steele.
Yeah, what I see this doing is establishing default. And if it is not specifically addressed, then in the negotiation,
Right, and that's true. So, that's, it's not that it's, that's actually very true. But if you had an unsafe situation, because we have a strong mayor form of government, that was brought about by default, and do you think that strong mayor would not be held responsible? They would be, yeah. So it's, I'm just, it's not taking it off the table, it's just making you explain why.
Barbara Huff, Tuckness, Teamsters Local 959. The concern that we would have by including language like this, again, at least, and I can only speak on behalf of 959, but I believe that probably true of all of the other municipal groups out there, we negotiate across the table with the municipality, not in public. I see this actually taking issues that are very significant for the workforce and for the municipality and putting it in, or attempting to put it into a public forum that I don't believe is beneficial to the municipality any more so than the employees that we would represent there. And if I could finish, if I was the municipality, the position I would take, this is our right, this is not going to be a mandatory subject of bargaining, therefore scheduling's off the table. This is a management right. It would be the same as the number of employees that the city decides to hire. That's a managerial right. Scheduling actually gets into the nuts and bolts of how the bargaining unit members actually work with the municipality and making sure that the work gets done. And that has traditionally, I mean, even in private sector, it's a huge
So-
negotiable item.
Two questions to you then with this. One is, you brought up the private sector. With your construction jobs, do you negotiate the scheduling and the staffing of those jobs completely, or is there some management rights in that?
Well, in the private sector, if that's what you're referring to, what you would be looking at would, again, the number of folks that we would actually be bringing or involved in at that particular work site. If it's a 24/7 operation, definitely from a seniority comes into play, who's going to be working where and how you iron those out. The hospital, private sector hospitals out there where we have collective bargaining, I mean, scheduling, it's a huge issue because it does impact every single one of our members out there. And not to say that the management doesn't necessarily bring to the table a lot of those issues, but we represent the employees and we hear about those issues as well. And it's a mandatory subject of bargaining. By putting it here would actually be taking that off the table.
Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves because this is all addressed at the end of this proposed ordinance on how this process, because we had a long discussion in the drafting of this and what it means. And I'll have, and if it's all right with you, because this might come up again, I'll have Mr. Wheeler address, should we go right to the end of the ordinance, just so you know the process that we feel this, how we'd be addressing this? Because I had the same concern, because I understand you negotiate in private, you don't want all your negotiations out in public, and, you don't want executive session for everything. So I've had this long conversation, and if Mr. Wheeler could address it, it'd be great. That's all right. It's on page, page 26. Yes.
Through the chair, we're referring to section 370, 170. In the manner in which the personnel rules and collective bargaining intertwine. As noted by Assemblymember Steele, there are some default provisions in here, but that does not mean that they are an absolute or mandatory bar to making those defaults a subject of negotiation. It gives you a starting point. It gives you a placeholder in the event that a collective bargaining agreement currently in effect does not address the issue directly. It defines for you what the defaults are in those scenarios. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't become part of negotiation. And this section here addresses how the regulations that we would have on the books intertwine with the collective bargaining agreements. And you note there in the middle that we clarify that the regulations as the default may only be substituted by negotiated agreements that are specifically approved by the Assembly. And this ties into actions that this body took a few years ago in clarifying that letters of agreement and administrative letters and so on all need some kind of oversight and review by the Assembly, so that as representatives of all the constituents, you have the opportunity to weigh in on how these agreements are crafted and when and how and where they might deviate from the personnel rules.
And when we were talking process and timing, it would come to the Assembly as a final product, right? You wouldn't have to come to us asking permission to negotiate beyond the default.
There can be and may be situations where the Assembly gives us guidance prior to entering negotiation. And in doing so, it may decide to get more or less detailed. And so if there are certain issues that are hot button issues and the Assembly wants to provide guidance on the eve of negotiation, I could see that could happen. But generally speaking, you give more broad guidance, step one. Step two, yes, we're going to negotiate based on what we think that guidance is, and then bring to the Assembly what we think is the final agreement. And to the extent they don't have one, there's going to be some form of arbitration or some other action prior to getting the final.
And in that final agreement, say there's no arbitration, there could be some manner as far as addressing scheduling, and it would just be noted like our letters have been noted in the past, where we would just see that this is outside the default.
Sure, during the term of any CBA,
Right.
if the administration and the union come to an agreement, that would come to you in typically in the form of a letter of agreement.
Right, and so it was part of the final process, and it would be something that, not we, but some assembly would be voting on. So it's not a closed door is what I'm saying.
Ms. Gray Jackson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just for clarification, all right, so Matt, under 370-040, management's rights, scheduling, equipment and so forth, is management's right. If a union decides, well, we want to negotiate those subject matters, then it's up to the assembly to decide whether or not they can?
No, well, they could. They could do that in a resolution like we've done it in the past, where we set the parameters of what the negotiations are. Or, as that current administration would be negotiating with the unions, they would negotiate a scheduling change or whatever in their CAB. And then-
CBA.
They would negotiate it, and it would come in front of the assembly, and it would be noted that this scheduling change is in this CBA. So it would be, but then the assembly would have to approve it.
So if I can follow up, Mr. Chairman, please? So what I just said is correct. If the union decides that, well, we don't want management to have that right, we want to negotiate it, then it's up to the assembly to decide whether or not they can negotiate it.
Well,
I think that's a little troubling.
no.
You
I
know?
mean, it's,
That's what it says back here, 26.
That's what it says.
it could be, you could have an assembly that, as I say, set the parameters for the next round of negotiations. And they would say, we do not want to have scheduling as part of the union negotiation. Or the administration and the union are having their standard negotiations. They are discussing whatever they're going to discuss, and it's brought to the table. And then the assembly, as always, has to approve whatever the agreement is, correct?
You're talking about something a little bit different than what I'm talking about specifically, because the way I read this ordinance, if I may, Mr. Chairman, the way I read this ordinance is exactly what I just stated. You know, it's management's right, scheduling and equipment, whatever else it says here. But then the back page it says, but if the assembly wants to change, it's up to the assembly to change that part of the negotiation. And I mean, that's what I'm.
Dennis, I'm not making, because
So there's different inputs and there's different strengths to those inputs. The assembly can change the code, right? Change the balance of what is or isn't a management right. It takes 6 assembly members to change the code. The assembly can provide guidance up front. That guidance can be very general. We're looking for these 3 or 4 factors in any negotiated agreement, or this agreement with this particular union. That's another input, right? Then you have another input at the back end, which is you're going to approve that contract or you're not going to approve that contract. So yes, you have inputs where the assembly can be influenced by their constituencies, whether it's the union membership or the general public or any other interest group that's interested in the outcome. So you have inputs at the beginning in terms of setting policy, setting code, and then at the back end in terms of whether you approve the contract or not.
Can I follow up one more time, Mr. Chairman, please?
Absolutely.
The resolution that the assembly approves, okay, notoriously, is setting guidelines.
That's right.
Okay, right, that's it, just setting guidelines. It's not telling the administration or the unions what to talk about in negotiations necessarily. That's truly up to them, because we don't play a role in negotiations. But again, I'll just say this, and then we can move on, Mr. Chairman. I think the way it's worded here is clear to me, and it's a little bit troubling. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Steele?
Not to beat a dead horse, but by putting this in the contract, if a situation comes up and management says there's an issue, there's a job to do, they have to go do something, and they say, use this equipment and this staffing, and the union says, no, that staffing's not safe. We do not want to do that. That is going to put people in danger. But this says that the city has the right to do that. My problem with that is hopefully any reliable management or supervisor is going to take that professional input into consideration. But it's going against the contract if the ordinance, if the ordinance has been approved, saying that is management's responsibility. It seems to me, working together to agree on what those standards are is a better process. But
Right, I'm sorry. To try this another way, management and labor can negotiate anything that they want.
okay, this is just guidance.
Right.
It's not law.
They can negotiate anything they want. But when the contract would be presented, it would be called out. It would say, these following provisions the following provisions are inconsistent with the personnel rules, or the following provisions are specifically having to do with scheduling.
Yeah.
So, in other words, when you would be considering and approving the collective bargaining agreement, you would be doing it within the context of understanding that these things were changed.
I guess, not being an attorney, I'm concerned about the difference or the relationship between the ordinance and the contract. And then real world application of that.
Yeah.
So I'm a little concerned about putting a lot of detail in the ordinance as opposed, well, I guess I don't have a good understanding of the relationship between the ordinance, the negotiated contract, and where the assembly stands.
Through the chair, if I might, Mr. Steele, when it comes to safety issues, the municipality should be more focused on what the liability would be if it doesn't follow the sound advice of experienced employees and managers, whether it's risk of injury to the employee or damage to property or risk to injury to a third party. So that's going to be the greater driver over safety issues than I think exactly how specific the contract is about a certain piece of equipment.
Shouldn't the ordinance be overarching and the agreement be more the detail, the contract be more the detail?
I think that's one way to describe it. I mean, certainly the contract would, in the contract, you want to call out those things that provide substance to the framework.
Safeguard the job.
That's right.
We need to move on this issue, but let me just add, so as the labor lawyer here, and I'm still a little confused about it, but I just want to clarify my understanding of what this does, and correct me if I'm wrong. Putting things such as scheduling into the management rights provision means that at the end of the day, the default on scheduling is, if there's a disagreement between the firefighters or whatever union and management about a scheduling issue, at the end of the day, having it in the management rights section says the municipality gets to decide. And there can be a process for, arbitrating that or changing it or claiming it's unsafe or whatever. But it's really setting the default as and it doesn't mean that management's going to necessarily get into the scheduling about, how many men on a fire truck or all those things. But to the extent there are negotiations over that issue, the municipality gets the decision as to whether, one, it wants to discuss it, or two, if there is a disagreement, who prevails. Is that correct, essentially?
Yes, except I would just add, in terms of whether the union wants to discuss it, we have this good faith obligation to meet and confer. So if the union wants to talk about it, we would certainly talk about it. Doesn't mean that we would reach an agreement, but we do have an obligation to have that conversation.
Right.
One more follow-up as far as you might meet and confer, but then the default goes back to the city.
As a management right, I think that's what it really says, is the municipality has at the end of the day,
Reserves the
the right
rights.
to determine those things.
Labor law, where you read it correctly.
And the liability.
And the liability, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's,
So when negotiations open up, management and the union can come together and say, we want to talk about staffing, and the city can say, no, we're not going to talk about staffing.
Well,
And
the
that'll
city
be
has-
the end of the day.
the city has an obligation to bargain in good faith. They don't have an obligation to agree, I think is what Mr. Wheeler was saying.
And if there's no agreement, then it'll default to what the city would like.
Ultimately, on issues that are management rights, there could be challenges to it through arbitration or disagreements, but, well, yeah, depending on the situation, but.
It's stated in law that that's management rights, it defaults to the city.
Yes, sir. That's my read on it.
There's no going around it through the assembly or as.
Well, the assembly could approve, I mean, in the negotiation, say an issue comes up about how many men on a particular piece of equipment, and the city decides to agree with the, actually, I'm a little confused about it, because the ordinance itself doesn't specify any kind of scheduling. So there would be no need for the municipality to come to the assembly and say, we're going beyond the ordinance. The municipality can choose in the negotiations to agree to whatever the union wants without having, the contract has to be approved. But I don't think that if you guys wanted 5 guys on a particular piece of equipment, you negotiated with the city said, okay, we thought 4, but we'll go with 5. I don't think that requires any specific notice to the assembly that we've said 5 instead of 4. It's still within the ordinance. It's still the management's right to agree to that, and they have. Sir?
But I would say, my question would be, before you even got to that, when you're opening up the books for negotiations and you say, we would like to talk about staffing on fire apparatus, ultimately the city could say, no, we're not going to talk about that.
Yeah, I think at some level they have the ability to foreclose
Safety
negotiations on the issues that are management rights.
And that is our work.
What's that?
And that's our concern.
Understandable. And I mean, yes, there is the ability on any management right for management to be unreasonable. It's hard for me to imagine specifically the city saying, on safety issues in particular, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to decide how many firefighters are needed on a particular equipment or how many other members. But the possibility does exist. Yes, sir.
Not getting off on the scheduling and moving back to 370.170. Is this the time to talk about that now? Or would you like me to wait till we get further?
Well, let's just go for it.
All right. My concern is that the way I read this is the personnel rules are the collective bargaining agreement unless the assembly approves something different. That's how I read that. Was that your intent?
Yeah, I mean,
On page 27, line 2.
3.70.170A. The way I'm reading this is, if this passes, for now on, the personnel rules are the collective bargaining agreement unless the assembly specifically allows us to do something different than the personnel rules. If that's your intent, then I have a fundamental objection to that.
where are you again?
He's reading
It's on
170.
page 27 of 29, lines 1 and 2, where it says provisions of personnel negotiate agreements upon specific approval of the assembly. That's where he's looking.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Wheeler?
Take a stab at this. If you think about how this relates to the other provisions in code that require you to approve letters of agreement, administrative letters, and collective bargaining agreements, that little phrase, upon specific approval of the assembly, is just a relation back to those other code provisions that require your approval. This does nothing new in that sense. It's always been the case that when a collective bargaining agreement does not cover an issue, you refer to the personnel rules. There's nothing new there.
I don't think the intent is to replace collective bargaining agreements with an ordinance, if that's the question.
Right.
And I don't think this does that.
Having recently gone through a 9-month experience negotiating with the city, I have a different opinion.
The only narrows it in terms of how it could be dealt with, may only be substituted by negotiators.
I think we have at least a sufficient understanding, if not a sufficient agreement on those provisions regarding the management rights. Can we move on?
Right. Page 7. That's mainly cleaning up work. 8. Number 6, determination regarding disputes between management and unions regarding positions exempt from collective bargaining as identified in section 3. That's cleared. I don't think that, unless you have any problems with that. In fact, most of this is on the Employee Relations Board, and unless you folks, do you have issues with this part of the code, the changes in here? This sets out the process, right to subpoena.
Why don't we, in the interest of time, as it's taking a while, if you could just perhaps hit the areas that you think may be the most contentious or the most significant changes to current law.
I'm not sure if there's anything here unless somebody can bring one up that they find completely contentious.
Seeing that,
And collective bargaining units, line 22 and 23, supervisory or confidential employees should not be members of the bargaining unit. And probably, I don't know if anybody has a problem with that.
What page are you on?
Page 9,
Thank you.
line 22 and 23.
There is no 23.
It's the pagination is different if you haven't.
Oh,
I've got,
sorry.
yeah, I've got
It's under collective bargaining units.
Okay.
It's A, and it's the last sentence. And if you continue to go down onto C, there's been a number of employees taken out. You can see some language taken out. Otherwise, it's all judge employees, all supervised employees, office of the mayor, staff, municipal manager. So a lot of the and then you get to line 42, or no, whatever, 16, item 16, the central patrol office within the finance department, no matter where located. That might be, this is back to our discussions as far as payroll.
That's great, Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question. Okay, on page 11, line 20, number 16. Okay, it says the staff of central payroll is going to be executive. So right now, aren't the payroll clerks union right now? They're all union.
They're not.
They're not? How many of them are?
How many are?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I think there's ask you what you mean by a payroll clerk, because in the departments, there are timekeepers who are doing some of the data entry associated with payroll. And then in the central payroll department, we have those that are processing and doing the analytics.
Right, and if I may follow up, Mr. Chairman. So the positions that you just outlined, according to this ordinance, are going to now be executive. So my question is, well, that's what it says.
Oh, I'm sorry,
They're
it's
exempt.
non-rep. They'd be non-represented.
non-rep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Non-rep. Okay, well, they won't be, all right.
They will be
Non-rep.
outside.
I'm sorry, I'm using the word executive in error. Non-rep or executive? Non-rep, okay. So my question is, how many of these positions right now are union? Or, I mean,
I'm thinking about, okay, number 17. Okay, number 16, everyone in the central payroll office is exempt from bargaining. They're all non-reps, okay? Number 17 addresses employees who consist of payroll function, or time entry for other employees. Okay, that would be some of the timekeepers that are in the departments. And I would estimate currently that there are less than 10, probably more like maybe less than 6.
Okay.
So, I mean, in that range.
Thank you. My point, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to know, based on the proposed ordinance, how many current union positions will no longer be union?
Understood.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucinda.
And I'd like to point out too, I mean, there are a lot of timekeepers where that's not their full-time job. Okay, so we would, have to look at that as well.
Certification of bargaining representative, and I think there's only one line as far as setting it as 180 days before date of presentation. And that is also in the consent recognition, unless there's any problems with that.
Mr. Chairman? I might have been a little asleep at the wheel here, but going back to page 8, did I miss the discussion on item number 6, as well as E, the new G and the new, oh, actually, I guess the new G.
There was no discussion on it. Would you like to have some discussion on it?
Well, yes.
Go ahead.
It's been quite a few years since I've dealt with the Employee Relations Board, but just reading through some of these changes, I'm trying to better understand the proposal on item number 6, where you're getting rid of the designation in accordance with and adding determination regarding disputes.
Mr. Wheeler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The idea here is that the board does not have the jurisdiction to designate up front. Instead, the board is there to resolve a dispute between the administration and the bargaining unit. So it doesn't go to the board out of the gate. In other words, we don't create a PCN in the position and then send it to the board for determination. Instead, we create the position, we discuss with the union. If there's not agreement, the board's there to resolve it. That's the only difference there. They don't decide first, they resolve the dispute.
Then continuing on, under number 8, the issuance of subpoenas has all been deleted. Is there an explanation for that?
It's all been just reshuffled into subsection E, and I don't recall particularly there being any debate about this first time around, but this is just a repeat of what was proposed in 37 originally. It's just a cleanup of some sort. I don't remember all of it, but the subpoena power is still there.
So under the new E, there's been an insertion of at least 5 working days before the hearing. If there's information that actually comes up during the time of the hearing, and trust me, this has happened over the years, would this preclude us then from making that request to the board because we'd be outside that 5 working day?
I don't think so. I think the board would look at the expedited nature of the request and whether it's justified.
Not really. I mean, I think what Mr. Wheeler said is correct. I think the answer is they could refuse to grant it, but they would have the ability to weigh whether it's timely, untimely, or whether there's a good excuse for it.
Mr. Chairman, I guess just to follow up, and I think probably the municipality would have the same or similar impression of a hearing before the Employee Relations Board or an arbitration, unlike the court proceedings where both sides pretty much know all of the evidence and the documentation that's being presented. In an arbitration, or in this case before the Employee Relations Board, we don't necessarily know all of those arguments and we're not presented. And it's not just the union. I mean, the management could find themselves in the same or similar situation. I'd be real concerned that would actually limit our ability on either side if there was new information that came up.
It's certainly something that can be addressed. I mean, I don't think that's a definitive issue for anybody.
And just as a reminder, there's a whole chapter of default provisions for administrative adjudications in Title Chapter 60 that contain more procedures to the extent that this doesn't address a particular in the procedure.
So we might look into this. We'll see.
I don't see any bar to asking the board for an exception if they need a subpoena on the fly. That's kind of the point here. There's no intent here to limit it in that sense, but to encourage both sides to give as much advance notice as possible so we can process that and get people under the subpoena and in front of the hearing. You gotta have time to serve it and get the person there.
We can go to page 10 when we get down here. If we go to page 10, line 43. Used to say a portion of the treasurer's staff, now it's going to be all in. How many employees are we talking about? I don't know whether they're non-rep or union. How many employees are we talking about?
Again, less than 10. I don't have.
Are they
the exact-
non-reps now?
Right now, the group is non-reps and AME union combined. Okay, so there's a mix. And so the objective of this is for the treasurer to be able to more efficiently manage his group and move duties around between non-reps and union.
Less than 10 now?
Yes. I'll double, if that number is wrong, I'll send you an email. I'll send you all an email.
Thank you.
Okay, that's my guess.
Again, it's 1 o'clock. We have a number of other items to get through, so if we could just sort of hit the highlights on this, and if there are significant changes to existing code or things that we believe are controversial, and if anybody else has any, we'll give you a chance to raise those as well.
Right, and as far as collective bargaining, the only thing that isn't in this, and I'm thinking that I might want to add a number 3 on B. We've got what the collective bargaining results should have as far as a summary of effects and a 3-year projection of the total operating budget. But we took out, or we haven't added what we did in AL 37, that you have a 3-year term on collective bargaining. So that's open for discussion, but it isn't in this. And unless there's anything as far as remediation and fact-finding, that,
I just have one, I don't know if it's technical or not, but when I reinstalled the old dates.
What page in line?
I'm sorry, I'm on 370-100. My page number is the bottom of page 15. So it's the section entitled Mediation and Fact Finding. So there was quite a bit of discussion about the proper dates to start negotiations, how far in advance of the end of the contract, that sort of thing. Well, working with the numbers, it didn't look to me like those days actually worked. There was some conflict. So while I'm reinstalling them as proposed, I think there needs to be some, at some point, some consideration and recommendation about how many days do we need and where to put those time frames are actually going to work.
right, and that would be something that we look from some advice on.
Right. I haven't consulted with ER or finance or the unions for that matter as to
Right.
what that should look like. I just rather put it back in the way it was written, and I think we'll give us some
Somebody can take
recommendation.
note of that and see if you have any suggestions, it would be helpful. And then what I asked Dennis in drafting this, for the arbitration, I asked for baseball arbitration. And that basically is the arbitrator picks, they have the last 2 best offers and has to pick one or the other. So that's in here. I'm not sure what page you folks have it.
What page
When they're
are you
binding
on?
arbitration or?
It's binding arbitration.
Then in this version is 26 of 29, lines 32. Binding arbitration.
Right, but it's on my page. The scope of the arbitrator's authority, is number 7 on item C, page 17.
Page 20 on ours.
20, okay.
20 on ours.
And it basically spells out that you pick one or the other. And the reason I've been such a fan of binding arbitration is that means that everybody's working to the last minute to get the best agreement possible. And they each know that one or the other is going to be picked, so hopefully there's more of a sense of cooperation versus lowballing or highballing or whatever you're going to do, and having a huge difference between the two positions.
The section is 370-110, C7, scope of arbitrator's authority. On each subject, the arbitrator shall select one party's proposal in its entirety, and then the next page has some definitions and lists those categories. This is a return to the way the code was prior to 37.
And,
Chairman, I got a question for Jennifer.
and otherwise, yeah, or-
On page 20 of 29, this version, we're dealing with binding arbitration. When I look at lines 12 on, it says collective bargaining agreements awarded through this, through binding interest arbitration may not exceed 2 years in duration. What if the police union or the fires are going for a 3-year contract, which we normally do?
That's current code, though, isn't it?
No, we can
Right.
change current code.
This
Why
is,
2 years?
this is the old code.
Why not
Prior to
change it
37.
to the term of the
I
contract?
I don't know that there was ever any discussion one way or the
Yeah.
other, so I couldn't tell you.
And I
But
would-
if I'm dealing with this, I want to change it.
I'd be open to that.
But I think Ms. Johnston said she was indicating she wanted to change it so it had to be 3 years.
Yes, yeah.
I
Actually,
find it to be odd, it says 2.
sorry, through the chair, Ms. Johnson's earlier comment about 3 years.
3 years,
was
that
that there
was
was
the contract.
There was originally in 37 a provision that no CBA, no new CBA would be greater than 3 years. This one's focused particularly on binding arbitration agreements, being limited to 2 years. So there's sort of two different conversations there.
But I'd be open for discussion on
Thank you.
Jennifer, I had one question on the baseball arbitration. The provision that Dennis indicated, it would be baseball arbitration, but it would be issue by issue, not total agreement by total agreement. Is that how it works?
It's issue by issue, subject by subject.
that. Okay, see, I was.
So there was a difference between what you said and what he said.
Actually, I guess we lost the communication thing.
Did you say issue by issue?
No, I'd rather have it contract by
All
contract. I'd
But
rather
Dennis
have
says
it
issue
all-
by issue?
Yeah,
Okay, so the old code was subject by subject.
Right.
Those were defined.
right.
Your request is really that an arbitrator take the totality of one offer
Right.
over the totality of another offer. Okay. That's not,
And
this is not written.
See,
that way.
I was reading the paragraph I wanted to read and didn't.
There's two different ways to do it.
So anyways, that might be something I will be amending or having an S version on, because I firmly do believe in baseball arbitration. I think it sets a healthier environment.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, sir.
Just from my years of experience negotiating contract, baseball arbitration, one employee, one club, or the whole team. What you're gonna do is you're gonna set up a situation where it's gonna be positional bargaining. We're not gonna look for the common ground. We're gonna look at positional bargaining where we're gonna come with the deal that we wanna get that arbitrator to pick. And the city's gonna do the same thing. I think you're gonna throw up an impediment to getting a resolution of the collective bargaining process by going to baseball arbitration.
So you don't think that because an arbitrator can just pick one or the other, you won't get closer to a common goal?
That's
because-
correct.
Because you're betting on that they'll pick you, and so you'll get everything you want in it.
Exactly.
And
I think it's a bad move to go to baseball arbitration in the terms of labor relations for the city of Anchorage.
I'd follow that up with, I think typically, contracts, majority of contracts are pretty easily pretty easily decided upon, and there's several key issues typically that are maybe contentious to both sides. That I think when those go to arbitration, those specific issues rather than the whole contract itself.
so you probably have agreement on most of the contract except those contentious issues, right?
I would say so.
So again, it would be, so you take one or the other, but.
Or just go issue by
I
issue.
mean, this is the kind of conversation that's worthwhile. I've just always kind of liked the concept.
Mr. Chairman, and not to drudge up history, but sometimes if we don't understand history, we tend to repeat ourselves. And not to focus on this administration, but any administration in the future, depending on who the administration hires to negotiate the collective bargaining agreements, really does determine or define what those issues or issue is going to be in negotiations, no matter what the collective bargaining agreement is. And I was around in the 1980s. I'm not going to mention who the mayor was, but he did hire an attorney who negotiated all 5 labor agreements. Every single one of those contracts was negotiated into arbitration. And if you look at, we had, and I was with the AMEA group at the time, 135 open issues that went to an arbitrator. 135. I mean, there were things that were things that we should have been able to agree on, that there was a conscious decision made for whatever the reason. And we did, and even with the baseball analogy there, still with us going into arbitration, we were real careful about how we actually proposed the language, knowing that this third party, and literally this arbitrator wrote our collective bargaining agreement, and it did go before the assembly. They actually thought they didn't have the votes to pass it. We got it passed. But it's, again, depending on who the individuals are, and I'm not pointing fingers at this administration at all, but I think anything that you're actually putting into law that covers whoever ultimately gets elected, having that kind of balance really is important for the process. And the last thing we'd want to do is end up in arbitration. We'd rather be able to negotiate a contract that's free-flowing from both sides.
In the interest of time, we have other issues. If there are any remaining comments on Ms. Johnston's resolution, burning issues you want to address at this meeting, there's no final action being taken at this meeting, just so you know, but we definitely want to give you the opportunity to comment.
And I think we actually went through a lot of the issues that I had noted. Was there some other items?
Any others before I move on? Seeing none, there'll still, like I said, there'll be still plenty of opportunity to discuss this. Nothing final is happening here. But since we have limited time, I'd like to move on now to Mr. Trainey's perhaps simpler and if not more elegant solution.
Less paper. One sheet, just reverses things back the way we were before AO 37S2 as amended was passed. It just takes it back, and by the way, it's being introduced on Tuesday.
Right.
So that you know.
If you want to just take a moment, perhaps, just to advocate for your position, if you would.
I saw these people come and testify when we had it in front of us. This just does what you asked us to do. You asked us to kill it off. This takes it back to where we ended up before it passed. We know how we negotiate labor under the old law. This takes it back to that point in time. And we move forward. That's all it does. It's being introduced on Tuesday.
Are there any questions for Mr. Trainey? Ms. Ray Jackson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a question. I just want to let folks know that the public hearing will be on June 24th. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No other questions? We'll move on. As you see on the agenda, at our last meeting, we discussed both of these two alternatives we put forward. The task of this subcommittee was to look at ways to avoid the cost, perhaps, of having the referendum in November. Costs, we're not sure of the amount at this point. So we've had the resolution, or the proposed amendment of Ms. Johnston that repeals AO 37, but replaces it with another change to existing code. We have Mr. Trainey's proposal, which repeals AO 37 and nothing further at this point. I wanted to make sure we put on the table that there are other options that can be addressed, and just so it's part of this committee's debate. And one is to leave AO 37 on the ballot in November. A lot of people were very interested in gathering signatures and putting that on the ballot and having the people of Anchorage vote on it. It is an issue that, I think is, ultimately very important, should be very important to every person in Anchorage, whatever side they are on. So I think there is a lot of merit in having that issue be voted on. As you heard from Ms. Jones at the beginning of our meeting, we're still in negotiations as to what the cost would be, and we should have a better idea of that by the end of next week, hopefully by Friday of next week, what kind of agreement we can have with the state. It could be a fairly minor amount, or it could be a very expensive amount, and I think that decision will certainly and should impact what the Assembly chooses to do with this. But I just wanted to make sure that, that is an option. My position would be, even if it's the expensive option, let the people vote on November. The second option related to that is if no agreement is reached between the two clerks' offices, the ordinance that moved the issue to November states that it will be moved yet again to the next municipal election. Obviously, the value in that to the municipality is that having it on a municipal election would eliminate effectively any additional cost. There could be some very minor cost involved in that, depending on the length of the ballot, but would be essentially a cost-free option. But again, delays this whole issue until March. It does have the benefit of letting the people, letting people vote on it, which has a value, I think, in itself. But I just wanted to put those out there. If there's any comments about any of those, to get them on the record here before the subcommittee. Mr. Murphy.
I would offer one more, and that is, the referendum did state that there's option for a special election. So as you stated, there is obviously the financial burden of November, but let the people vote, so we could accomplish that with a special election as well.
I think that would incur the full cost, I would imagine, but that's true, that would be a third option. Any other comments by anyone? No? What the sort of plan for moving forward on this, so as Mr. Trainee mentioned, himself and Mr. Peterson and Ms. Gray-Jackson have proposed their ordinance as a repeal. They're introducing it to the full assembly, and that process will go forward. This subcommittee will wait until after next Friday till we have word from the clerks' conversations to see what kind of deal we have, and we'll probably schedule a meeting for the following week, so 2 weeks hence, and we can get a full report then from the clerks and see where we're at. And the goal would be for this subcommittee to report its conclusions, its recommendations, or whatever comes out of this to the full assembly by its second meeting, which would be June 24th in June. Any questions, comments on that? Any public comments on any issue? Okay, member comments? Seeing none, we're adjourned.
Hope everybody's riding their bike to work.